Hi, I'm Phil Candriva, and welcome to the first of 4 short videos outlining the parameters of federal fiscal or appropriations law. This first video provides a little bit of a background. We'll talk about the U.S. Constitution and the authorities that it provides, giving Congress the power of the purse. We'll define what an appropriation is and look at the various types of appropriations. We'll also define some key vocabulary related to the use of this spending authority. And then we'll introduce the overarching legal framework before the subsequent videos get into that in a bit more detail. So Article 1 of the Constitution discusses the legislature. Section 8 talks about the powers of Congress, and Section 9 talks about the limitations of Congress. And Section 9, Clause 7 says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of an appropriation made by law. And a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So no government official is allowed to spend money on anything in the absence of one of these laws that we refer to as an appropriation. The word appropriation comes from the Latin. It means to set aside or to make one's own or to fit, to be appropriate, if you will, right? And so a lot of appropriation law fits this category, that funds are set aside for a particular use and provided to an organization, an agency that's theirs and nobody else's to use for particular things. And Title 31 of the U.S. Code, which covers financial matters, says that a law may be construed to make an appropriation only if the law specifically says that's what it is doing. So if you're not sure whether or not you have an appropriation, and an authorization bill sort of looks like an appropriation because it authorizes appropriations to exist, it really isn't an appropriation because it doesn't come right out and say that. Okay. And as I mentioned, an appropriation is a positive authority. So this quote from U.S. versus McCollum, the established rule is that the expenditure of public funds is proper only when authorized by Congress, not that public funds may be expended unless prohibited by Congress. Right? You can do it unless it's prohibited is what we refer to as a negative authority. An appropriation is the opposite. It's a positive authority. And there are various types of appropriations that are out there. Most of us are familiar with the regular annual appropriations for the discretionary portion of the federal budget. So the annual defense appropriation bill is one. Then there are permanent appropriations. So many of the mandatory spending programs, such as Social Security, such as Medicare, retirements for federal employees, are found in permanent appropriations. That Congress does not need to pass a new appropriation every year for those funds to flow. If you are eligible, if you meet the criteria, you get the money. Sometimes the regular appropriation is deemed to be insufficient because something happens. Maybe we have a national emergency, a hurricane. Maybe we have a pandemic. Maybe a war breaks out. These are things we would not have anticipated in the budget, would not be in the appropriation, and Congress can then pass a supplemental appropriation, providing additional funding to respond to that contingency. We also have continuing appropriations. It's common that the annual appropriation is not passed by the beginning of the annual federal fiscal year, in which case we need a stopgap spending measure, which we refer to as a continuing appropriation, or more colloquially, a continuing resolution. This provides funding at the rate of spending that existed in the last appropriation. So it should be thought of as a continuation of the prior year, not a down payment of the current year, because things in the current year budget have not been approved yet. And then the last category of appropriations really doesn't exist anymore, but it did exist at one time, back in the 19th century. It was not uncommon for an agency to overspend their appropriation and then go to Congress and say, gee, sorry, we spent more than you provided for us. We have these bills that need to be paid. We need a deficiency appropriation. And Congress would feel compelled to pass this appropriation in order to pay these bills. This is where we get the name of a major fiscal law called the Anti-Deficiency Act was that Congress got tired of this behavior and thought that the executive branch should be more disciplined in the way they manage their money. So those are the various types of appropriations. When we think about an appropriation and how they work, a good analogy is taking your child to the county fair. So you go to the county fair with your child and they say, mommy, mommy, or daddy, daddy, it doesn't matter. May I go play arcade games? You know, where you throw the softball and knock down the clown and you win a stuffed animal. And you say, sure, Timmy, you can go play arcade games. Here's the family debit card. You can spend up to $20, no more. And you can only use this money. You can only use this debit card to play arcade games. No funnel cakes, no soda, none of that stuff. And meet me at the Ferris wheel in 45 minutes. So what do we have here? We have the parent saying to the child, you may spend up to $20. So we have a limit on the dollar amount the child can spend. We have a limit on the purpose for which the $20 is provided. Arcade games only, no food. And we have a time limit during which the child can spend that money. Meet me at the Ferris wheel in 45 minutes. Purpose, time, and amount are the three characteristics of appropriations, and they work similar to these instructions you've given your child at the county fair. So let's take a look at an appropriation. Here is the language from the fiscal year 2021 Defense Appropriations Act. And Title I covers military personnel, Title II covers operation and maintenance, Title III covers procurement, and so on. And you can see the language here. For pay, allowances, individual clothing, subsistence, on and on. And this is military personnel. Army is the first paragraph here, and there's a dollar amount. And what is implied in this appropriation, and in fact, it shows up later in the appropriation, that these funds are available for 1 year, unless otherwise specified. An appropriation provides what we refer to as budget authority. And budget authority is the legal authority granted to a federal manager to obligate the government to make payments from the Treasury to satisfy those obligations. Without an appropriation or some other law, a federal manager cannot put the government in a position where money needs to flow out of the Treasury. And how can you put the government in that position? Things like signing a contract, hiring an employee, requisitioning parts from the supply system, something like that. There are other sources of budget authority we're not going to talk about in these videos. One is called contract authority, which is the authority to oblige the government to buy things for inventory, for instance, that may be sold to another government entity later. Another source of budget authority are reimbursable transactions, but we're not going to talk about those. Second definition is apportionment. Once Congress passes this appropriation, the money or the ability to spend does not automatically transfer to the agency. The Office of Management and Budget has a process called apportionment, during which or through which the funding authority, the budget authority, is provided piecemeal, oftentimes on a quarterly basis, to the agency. So while the appropriation may say that the agency has $100 million to spend, if OMB only apportions $30 million in the first fiscal quarter, then the agency is limited to $30 million until there is a new apportionment. And the apportionment process is a request. The agency must request these funds or this budget authority from OMB, typically based on their annual spending plan that would have accompanied the budget. So as the federal manager goes to use this appropriation, they're going to incur what are called obligations. An obligation is a legal reservation of funds that will require a payment at some point in time from the Treasury. That payment may be immediate, it may occur soon, for instance, a government purchase card transaction, or that payment may occur years later if we're buying something like a Navy warship. Signing a contract is an activity that creates this kind of an obligation. When the government signs a contract, they agree to pay a vendor, provided the vendor performs the service or provides the goods. And so once there is this firm, definite, certain legal commitment, we have what we refer to as an obligation, and we will record that in our accounting systems. When that contractor performs and we receive the goods and services and pay them, now we have an outlay. And this is the issuance of a check or an electronic funds transfer made to liquidate or satisfy that obligation that was made. And what's important to note here is that this is the first time that money actually changes hands. Up to this point, we've not been dealing with money, we've been dealing with legal authorities and permissions. An appropriation does not deposit money in the account of the federal agency. It simply says that that federal agency has this budget authority in order to spend, and they cite that authority so that the treasurer can move money. So we can look at a timeline. Various appropriations have, the budget authority is available for different periods of time. For much of the federal government, we have things called salaries and expense accounts. Within the Department of Defense, we call that operation and maintenance. These are typically 1 year appropriations. The funding is available at the beginning of the fiscal year, and it is said to expire at the end of the fiscal year. And I will define expire in a minute. Some other appropriation types have longer durations. RDT&E, research, development, test, and evaluation funding, lasts 2 years. Procurement money, we have 3 years to obligate. Construction money, there are 5 years. And there are a few accounts that actually never expire. The funds are available until expended. So what does it mean for funds to expire? Well, it means the authority to enter into new obligations has ended. Okay. So when we get to the end of the fiscal year, if we still have a remaining balance in the operation and maintenance account, that balance is no longer available for new obligations. Now, we may be able to adjust some existing obligations. Say we estimated the price of something at $1,000 and it turns out the price was $1,100. We can adjust that obligation because that's not a new purchase. It's simply adjusting the price of an existing purchase. Similarly, we can deobligate or reduce the amount on an obligation. Once those funds expire, regardless of how long that obligation period is, there's a period of time called the expenditure period that's 5 years long. And during this period of time, we can liquidate these outstanding obligations. So we can write contracts during the obligation period. That contract may not be satisfied or completed until after the funds expire, but we can still, and we must, make that payment during the expenditure period. Within 5 years, all of these contracts should be complete, should be paid, all that work should be done, at which point the appropriation closes and the Treasury no longer will conduct transactions citing that appropriation. And so if the appropriation closes 5 years after it expires, that entire period of time, the obligation period and the expenditure period, we refer to that as an open appropriation. Looking at this relationship between obligations and outlays, each year in the federal budget, OMB produces this chart, and here is the chart for fiscal year 2022 that sought $6.2 trillion in new spending authority in FY22, and they expected, looking across the top of the diagram, 4.474 trillion of that to expend during fiscal year 2022. The remaining balance of $1.738 trillion to be outlaid in some future year. Similar to the fact that not all of the FY22 funding would have outlaid or expended in the first year, we see in the bottom left of the diagram $3.77 trillion of prior appropriations still available. They may be obligated, they may be unobligated. Of that, 1.5 trillion or so is expected to outlay in 2022, with the rest continuing on for at least another year. So in order for this appropriation to be legally available for any purpose, three things need to be met. Three conditions need to be met. The first condition is the purpose of the obligation or expenditure, the thing that we're buying, must be authorized in that appropriation. The second condition is the obligation has to occur within the time limits applicable to the appropriation, that obligation availability period we just discussed. And third, the obligation and expenditure must be within the amounts that Congress has established. So if we look back at our Appropriation Act, we can see some language that touches on each of these three things: purpose, time, and amount. Here's a provision dealing with purpose. And in fact, it's a purpose that's not permitted. Here's section 8016 of the FY22 Defense Appropriation Act that says that none of the money available in that appropriation by the Department of Defense can be used to buy welded shipboard anchor and mooring chain 4 inches or less in diameter unless that chain was manufactured in the United States. And so this is a kind of a typical Buy American type provision in an appropriation. So although the anchor chain is certainly something that a defense appropriation would typically permit, and we would be perfectly within our rights in the Department of Defense to buy that anchor chain, it must be bought from a domestic source. So that's a limit on the use of the funding. Here's a limit on time. No part of any appropriation contained in this act shall remain available for obligation beyond the current fiscal year unless expressly so provided herein. So this statement is saying the appropriation is only good for 1 year unless there's a specific mention somewhere in the Appropriation Act that a portion of it may be available longer. And then notice the next statement says no more than 20% of it is available for obligations during the last 2 months of the fiscal year. And this is to make sure that we aren't saving too much of that appropriation and then spending it foolishly and recklessly late in the fiscal year just to use it up. So these three characteristics of purpose, time, and amount, each is memorialized, enacted in the US Code, the federal statutes. Title 31 deals with money, and we see in Title 31, Section 1301 is language dealing with the rules governing the purpose for which funds can be used. Time we find in Sections 1502 and 1552, and amount in the Anti-Deficiency Act, which really isn't a single act. It's a number of laws that sort of come together and define the rules regarding the amount of funding. So the next 3 videos in this series look at these 3 characteristics in turn. Video number 2 is about the purpose characteristic. Video number 3 is about time, and video number 4 is about amount. Thank you for watching.